to talk tonight about is how what happened to me in my thesis fits into the larger issue of repression of Palestinian and pro-Palestinian activists in Canada, and how that affects the work that we do. And in my case, in the case of the Coalition Against Israeli-Apartheid, the work that we really do is answering the 2005 call for boycott, divestment, and sanctions against Israeli-apartheid. And so, you know, even though so many of the attacks on me have been deeply and almost comically personal, I really believe that Peto Gate, that's what we're calling it back home, is not about me, and it's not even really about my thesis. And I think what it's about is the desperation of pro-Israel groups. And you can see it. They're frantically, and I mean frantically, trying to crush criticism of Israel, and especially the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement. And they're trying to do it through bullying and intimidation. That is their tactic. And, you know, similar to what Brian was saying, before I get going, I think it's really important to emphasize that when we're talking about repression in Canada, those of us that are not Palestinian like myself, especially people like me who enjoy white privilege as middle-class people with Canadian citizens, settlers on this territory, I think it's really important that we acknowledge when we're attacked, we don't face the same consequences as Palestinians, as Indigenous people, as folks of color. So, you know, repression against someone like me in Canada probably means a character assassination, but it can mean real assassinations for other people. And in doing Palestine work, we really need to talk about repression in Palestine. There's over 10,000 Palestinian political prisoners being held by the Israeli state, many of whom are children. Israel practices administrative detention, where you can be held basically indefinitely without trial, and that's happened to many of our friends and comrades. More and more BDS activists are being targeted, and they're being arrested, tortured, and detained without even access to basic legal representation. And I think what happened on the Mavi Marmara was a case of state repression, right? So people trying to do something as basic as bringing aid and food and the necessities of life were murdered on the high seas, basically. And I think we need to keep in mind that collective punishment of Palestinians is a really key pillar of Israeli apartheid. So, you know, I got attacked in the newspapers, mostly the National Post, which is hard to call a newspaper, and I got made fun of by the members of the Ontario Parliament, on the Ontario Legislature. But I know I'm not going to end up in prison. I'm not going to get tortured or killed for speaking out against Israeli apartheid. But there are others who face those very real consequences, and especially following the tremendous vision of people power in Egypt, we need to draw inspiration from people who face those real consequences. And for me, definitely doing Palestine work, I look at the 62 years of Palestinian resistance and draw so much strength from that, because if they keep fighting against what they're fighting against, then, you know, we better keep on fighting too. So to kind of get into it, to give you all some background about what happened, I'm just going to try to sum it up pretty briefly. So I finally graduated in June of 2009, and U of T no longer requires you to bind your thesis. You used to bind your thesis and you used to sit on a shelf in the library until I think they recycled them or something. But now you PDF your thesis and you stick it up online for everyone to find. And you know, I think that's a good thing, access to information. But what happened to me was a right-wing blogger was Googling me and stumbled onto my thesis. I'm not naive, right? I wrote a thesis that was critical of Holocaust education. I did a critical, you know, anti-racist analysis of how Jews became white people, and I asked a lot of really difficult questions. And again, not to be self-deprecating, but I'm not the first person to have done this, right? Like it's not the first time these ideas have been thrown around. There's a movie called Defamation, which actually goes on and documents the trip, the March of the Living, one of the trips that I critiqued. And when I watched it, I was like, oh, I just finished my thesis. This would have been good to cite, because he's kind of saying the same thing I am. Dozens of articles, several books have been written about the use of Holocaust memory to justify Israeli apartheid, including a book by Avram Borg, who's a former speaker of the Israeli Knesset, right? So again, like all MA students, we think we're amazing, we're trailblazing, we're these prodigies, but you build on the work of others, right? That's what you do at the master's level. So I'm being attacked not because these are new ideas, because I'm the first person to do it, but I'm being attacked because I talk openly, and I work with groups that talk openly, and I think really articulately and convincingly about Israeli apartheid. And I think also I'm being attacked because I do all this despite, you know, 18 years of Zionist brainwashing. Like, I grew up in Thornhill, just north of Toronto, which is an incredibly pro-Israel environment. I went to Zionist schools, I went to Zionist camps, I went to Zionist synagogues, I was inundated with it, and I came out like this. And And I think what it is that I'm a failed product of their system, right? And they're worried. They're frantically trying to figure out, like, what the hell went wrong in this case. And so in all of this, I think probably the most dangerous, the most alarming part of the saga with my thesis isn't the media attacks and the blogosphere, which I don't dare to venture into anymore. I think the most worrisome part is what happened in the legislature. Because according to various experts who really write about academic freedom, this is unprecedented. It's the first time that they can find that a Canadian master's student was criticized by a government body, right? And so, you know, when this was initially going on and the attacks in the media were happening and I was getting made fun of and criticized, I was like, okay, well, you know, we made fun of it on Facebook and we joked about it and kind of, but when it hit the legislature, we knew it had been kicked up a notch, and that's when we decided to spring into political action. And so what happened was Faculty for Palestine, which is an amazing group of faculty members who do incredible work, they issued a call out and they got people to write letters to members of provincial parliament and the head of all three provincial parties condemning this attack. And I think the reason that people were so alarmed, because they get what the point of this is, and the point of this is to send a chill through the academic world, right? This message is loud and clear. Don't talk about Israeli apartheid or you're going to face some serious consequences, right? And so the mobilization around my case was, I can't even thank people enough for how incredible that support was on a personal level. But I think it's actually more significant for students and faculty that are coming after me that see this and may have been afraid, right? And may not wanted to pursue their studies or lecture on these issues. And so when we counteract this in such a strong and powerful way, we counteract that chilling effect. And that's really, really, really important. Censorship is always political, and it's always a move by the powerful. And repression is about maintaining the status quo. And in Canada, we can't forget that status quo is uncritical support of Israel. The status quo is billions of dollars of free trade between the two countries, most of it military trade. And so our fight shouldn't be focused on repression and free speech, but it should be focused on the power structures that not only facilitate, but thrive from that repression. So we shouldn't get stuck in the trap of only talking about our right to be activists, right? And that can happen. Our best fight back is to continue to do our work. And when this repression comes up, we should use it to our advantage. We should use this to bring attention to issues in Palestine and to say to those people, are you frustrated about this? Are you frustrated about these attacks on free speech? The solution is to fight back against the people that are doing it, and the best way to fight back is through boycott, divestment, and sanctions. Economic ties to Israel are what this really boils down to, and they say it outright. Ontario is working really, really hard to increase its economic links to Israel at the same time that they're going after pro-Palestinian activists, and I think that's a really key point, right? Canadian support for Israel, it's complex, right? It's in part ideological. Settler colonial nations with histories of ethnic cleansing and genocide sure have a lot in common, and they need to defend the shared legacies of that brutality from each other, right? I mean, South African apartheid was modeled on the Canadian reservation system, and Israeli apartheid is very similar. So, these things are all connected. There are strong racist, colonial, ideological shared roots there. And there's also a growing sort of evangelical Zionism in Canada, and these are people who are deeply anti-Semitic, and they believe that all Jews need to go back to Israel so that the rapture will happen. And they're being courted by the Israeli state and by groups like B'nai B'rith. It's a really, really messed up situation. But again, this is a lot about empire, it's a lot about economics, and it's a lot about geopolitics, and we know very well that Israel has acted as a proxy army for the West for years, and so they're very, very central to the military-industrial complex. When Vancouver was being fortified for the Olympics, when Toronto was being fortified for the G20, so much of that technology was developed by Israel, right? They treat the West Bank and Gaza like a weapons laboratory, and they're the world leaders in homeland security, right? And so obviously they're gonna defend those interests. Again, some of these attacks, or the defunding of the Canadian Arab Federation and Kairos, were really, really significant. The condemnation of Israeli Apartheid Week happening in the Ontario legislature, Michael Ignatieff did that. The poster for IAW in 2009 was banned in U of O, University of Ottawa, Carleton. And again, it was interesting. No one said anything about the massacre of 430 children in Gaza, but they sure had a lot to say about the poster depicting it. There was a conference at York University that was debating the one-state versus two-state solution in Israel-Palestine, and that conference came under an unprecedented attack. So SSHRC, the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council, is one of the major granting bodies in Canada, and it's at arm's length from the government. And it's really hard to get a SSHRC grant. It's extremely competitive. And that conference, I think, ranked in the 98th percentile, the proposal, and they got a SSHRC grant for this. And when the pro-Israel groups found out about this, they lobbied the government and the minister responsible for education and training in again, an unprecedented move, contacted Shirk, which is supposed to be at arm's length. It's a major attack on academic freedom, and demanded that they investigate the conference, right? And so the organizers were asked to submit all sorts of documentation that no one's ever had to submit on a conference that was daring just to even talk about the possibilities of one state versus two states. And again, a lot of people in the academic world rallied around that conference. You all know about, George Galloway, and it's interesting listening to the stuff at UBC, because students against Israeli apartheid that I've worked with at U of T and York have experienced so much repression, whether it's canceling of room bookings, trying to charge security fees when we're being attacked by the Jewish Defense League. I don't think they're active here, but wow, they're just like a bunch of thugs that come to our events and try to beat people up, and we have to pay for protection from them, which we obviously refuse to do. Fighting Canadian complicity and profit from Israeli apartheid, that's the best way to fight that repression, right? To just continue to do our work. So think about it. The controversy with my thesis led to a bunch of people reading my thesis. And it includes a lot of complex arguments, but in there, thanks to my supervisors, like, you should put this in there. There's like 5 or 6 pages all footnoted and documented where I argue why Israel is an apartheid state. And that's an unintended consequence for the Zionists, because now a bunch of people have read it and they can go to the links in my footnotes and learn more about it, and they're now much more armed to defend why, we shouldn't just talk about free speech around Israeli apartheid. It's accurate speech. It's an accurate analogy, and now more people know how to defend it. And so every time I talk, I think it's so important to thank everybody who's rallied around me and who stood up to these bullies shoulder to shoulder with me, right? And their bullying and intimidation is completely backfiring. And they lose public support with every Israeli war crime in Palestine, and with every act of censorship here. They lose more and more people. And they attack us this way because they have absolutely no other line of defense. And I think this is so important. Israel is a state that on a day-to-day basis carries out brutal acts of violence and displacement. Just over 2 years ago, they were wrapping up their brutal military assault on Gaza, which definitely opened up the world's eyes, because there were 1,400 people killed, including 430 children, right? The world couldn't ignore that anymore. Back in December, they used so much tear gas against the people of Bil'in that they killed a young woman whose brother they had killed 2 years earlier. Israel is a state built on the violence of over 60 years of ethnic cleansing that has seen refugees locked out of their homeland and forced to live in deplorable camps or without status all over the world. Israel is a state that hides behind F-16s, white phosphorus, naval commando units storming aid ships, and they do all of it with Canada's full support. So we here have a fundamental responsibility to use any means necessary to put a dent in that impunity enjoyed by the Israeli state. And we do that by continuing to take risks in spite of whatever they're going to throw at us. And it's becoming clearer and clearer that the pro-Israel lobby is getting more desperate, and they're getting desperate because they know they can't silence us. They know they can't stop the movement to end Israeli apartheid. So I'm going to be here, and I know you guys are going to all be here, and we're going to keep fighting until Israeli apartheid ends and Palestine is free. Thank you.